Hello, it's Senator Wilcox down here in Springfield on Memorial Day, and we just finished a few speeches on the floor from the veterans, and a couple people asked and said, there's more than what you said on the floor, isn't there? And I said, well, on the floor it was about two transitions, and it was communications and technology change over the last few decades, and then America's relationship with the veteran. But yes, the deeper transition is kind of what I went through in my military career. So I was asked to give the longer version that's been in my head. So the three transition starts as a 4, 5, 6-year-old, pulling out my dad's way oversized Army uniforms and going to Memorial Day, learning to salute in the most awkward of ways that young boys will figure out, but knowing that we were honoring something that at that time I didn't truly understand. And at the time, we were consuming media, Walter Cronkite on the news giving us just the facts, or the daily print newspaper, right? News was not 24/7 back then. So it was easy to not get overwhelmed by what was going on in the world, but we knew things were happening. By the time I was in middle school, we had the hostage overrun, or the embassy overrun in Iran, and the hostages taken in 1979. But at the time, I probably never knew, and maybe most of America did not know about the failed rescue attempt. That came about in my learning in the military, in my education, and the focus on the future of the Joint Staff, which I would be immediately and incredibly involved with in the military. Well, that 4-year-old progressed to wearing a uniform in high school. We had junior ROTC. So wearing a uniform one day a week and loving the ability to hop into a couple of flight simulators that were at our high school put me on a path. But it was junior year when the Marine Corps barracks in Beirut were bombed. And while not hearing the news immediately, there was certainly a pit in my stomach and an ache in my heart that I could not put into the words that I'm able to today. But you knew something bigger was going on, but you didn't understand it. Well, that high schooler in a uniform ended up going to college, hoping to be an Air Force pilot. But for an eye exam as a junior, it was a good thing I was also taking the engineering courses and paying attention, because without 20/20 vision, the Air Force had more qualified people for pilot seats and didn't need me in that role. Upon graduating from high school, I went to do acquisition. I was in Boston, no planes on the runway at Hanscom Air Force Base, so the transition was a little easier than if I'd had to listen to jets roaring off every day. But in a January in 1991, we were at the 99's restaurant preparing for a Martin Luther King Day weekend ski trip when CNN broadcast live war footage. And I think, and it was the first time that many of us, almost in an immediacy, had access to what was going on halfway around the world. So as good military members, we hugged some girls, said goodbye to some friends, and skedaddled back to base, fully expecting the gates to be locked and maybe to get orders of what would need to be done. Well, we get to the officers' club, and the gates aren't closed. Our bus is still there. And it was an odd recollection to think that a war halfway around the world wasn't going to impact us that day. So off to Canada we went to enjoy a skiing weekend, and the Gulf War was relatively short by many natures and correlations to some longer episodes, but realizing that how we learned about that war and what we saw on TV was changing. Well, I was also in acquisitions, and as an executive director, recommended a Wellfleet router over a Cisco router in those early days. Little did I know that branding and marketing would change the world in a different manner, but we chose the superior router of the time. But that was the start of a transformation in military communications that I did not understand what it would do, but was a part of that. Well, after that acquisition tour in the Gulf War, we kind of joked that was the war of our generation, which many generations have experienced just one major conflict. And we kind of laughed about how none of us would ever be president of the United States because we'd never get past what did you do on the opening weekend of the war? And our answer would have to be we went to Canada to go skiing. And so that would certainly bury any presidential nomination. Well, my follow-on assignment was to go to the CENTCOM arena, and while years later a shell of its former self during the Gulf War, I was now actively learning how to utilize this new technology in the support of military operations. Went to Saudi Arabia for an orientation tour, spent 3 weeks traveling to the different bases around the Mideast. Not necessarily sure why we still had such a large presence post the Gulf War, but it soon came to the forefront. 1995, as an American, if you're in Riyadh, you are going to go to Chop Chop Square at some point, and they are going to push you up to the front. So seeing a different form of justice, thieves losing a hand, drug cartel members or drug runners losing their head at that point in time, was a stark awakening. And I think it was intentional that as American service members, we were allowed to view that or pushed to view it a difference in society. Well, in 1995, OPM Sang had a car bombing outside of it in Riyadh. In 1996, Khobar Towers had a massive truck explosion, killing many members of the military. And at that time, we had our Air Operations Center in the basement of the Royal Saudi Air Force headquarters in downtown Riyadh, and that was no longer safe. So I'd been working with these new routers and dual fiber ring connectivity, and so we were asked to move the Air Operations Center out of Riyadh, out to the desert in Escon Village. And it was there that I got to see what was happening to communications. That first tour in the Middle East, I was reconfiguring satellite transponders to garner an extra 128 kilobits of bandwidth. That's what we would need to establish a new airbase somewhere, 128 kilobits. And 32 of that was for a dedicated phone to the commander. At that time, we were flying air operations orders daily out to the units to fly. Well, that was about to change. In that Air Operations Center, we set up that dual FIDI ring, and the speed of communications was changing significantly. And I would start to see it, but it was a reminder. When CNN was broadcasting that in '91, we're now less than half a decade later, and we are significantly changing the air operations centers. 1998, we have embassy bombings. Those air operations centers are in full swing, and what the warfighter is visually seeing is still different than what the American people see. But the transition was changing. Nightly news was becoming everyday news, all-day news, and the American public was now exposed at a deeper level. But the bigger transformation was changing in that relationship with the veterans. I grew up in a time much different than the era that Vietnam veterans came home to. Back then, if there were people that had displeasure with the conflict, they also had displeasure with the veterans, and it showed. There was not a mutual difference or a mutual respect of the veteran while maintaining a disgust with the conflict or a differing view of the conflict. And that was starting to change. I think, and I can't do a hard correlation or causation, but in 2001, now I am at Command and General Staff College, and that September morning, I'm watching the news, getting ready for school in the afternoon, and the news breaks on about a plane hitting one of the towers in New York. And while it looked like a horrible accident initially, when that second plane hit the towers on live TV in front of the world, in the pit of my stomach, I knew something else was going on. As that day grew and the Pentagon got hit and the plane went down in Butler, I knew my military career was going to change significantly and that we were not going to be the generation with just the Gulf War as our war of our generation. That spring, I took command of my first unit and knew going into it that within weeks of taking command, I would be deploying with them. Not because of my leadership, but because of the skill sets that I had learned over the past decade and what we were going to be asked to put in place in Kyrgyzstan to support the air bridge into Afghanistan. I ended up on the ground in Bagram, and I told the story, stepping on that soft dirt in Bagram and watching it kind of fluff up was reminiscent of the moon landing pictures and what zero gravity looks like, and in this case, it was just very fine dust. We're supporting special operators, riding on horseback. None of the communications gear that I was watching truly prepared me for that. But boy, the communications gear on that battlefield was still significantly different than anything we'd experienced before. We did that deployment and returned home, leaving all of our gear in Kyrgyzstan. When we got home, a week later, I was called to Langley and was briefed on upcoming plans. And the reality was all other combat comm units were previously marked for additional buildup in the region. And I was asked if our unit was going to be ready to do something that hadn't been done in some time. And having witnessed what they were capable of and what the technology was capable of, we said, absolutely. We just have no equipment. So I went back to the unit, and the story was operational readiness inspection in the spring. New equipment would be coming. We'd have to, break it out and test it and get it functioning. But, our airmen are not naive. And for a unit that was used to shooting at the range once a year just to qualify, heading to the range every week, getting that same M16 out of the armory, they knew that we were going to be asked to do something different. And by mid-March, we had loaded up on some very big transport planes and were sent off to Germany. We spent a number of days in Germany waiting for chaff and flares to be equipped on those transports. That was unnerving enough, but we bided our time. I got pretty good at dominoes. But getting back on that plane to fly out, we didn't know where we were headed. Well, it was to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, but those planes were not just going to remain there. While the chaff and flares were not for us that evening, we got a tasking order March 28th in the morning. We needed to prepare 3 pallets with the most vital of communications gear, and we'd have a manifest later that evening. That manifest came out. It was a C-130. It was those 3 pallets. And instead of my initial team, it was a single passenger, and that was myself. When that plane took off in the middle of the night, I kind of had an insight in where I was headed. But I kind of felt that we had hit the coastline of Iraq when that plane dropped to just a few hundred feet above ground level and started banking left and banking right. And I had a window over my left shoulder and a window across the way. And I could see the burnt out oil rigs or the tanks or trucks that were still on fire. And it was unnerving. A little bit later, we started to ascend 6,000, 8,000, 10,000 feet. And before I knew it, we were doing quite the opposite. We'd gone into a deep left bank and spiraling down. At the time, I didn't know if we'd lost an engine. I'd later learned that this was the death spiral approach into an airfield with active SAM missiles around. When that plane landed and got to the end of the runway, the back door came down, and I was told it was time to go. 3 pallets and myself off into the middle of the night. The engines didn't even stop on that C-130 as it took off down the runway, the ramp going up as it was headed out. No night vision goggles. I really could not make out much around me. As an outdoorsman from Vermont, there was something that caught my eye, and that was the galaxy above. In that midnight darkness, in that area with no lights around, it was amazing to look up and the vastness of this universe, and then to realize I'm sitting alone in a foreign country on an air base for the first time in 50 years has the U.S. opened an air base in enemy territory. It didn't take long, the spotlight popped up, that M16 gained on my shoulder to try and figure out what was going on. It was a forklift to grab the pallets and 3 gentlemen on motorcycles. The Special Tactics Squadron was on the ground. I gathered my belongings and told to walk down the tarmac for about a mile to the only building there. That was the start of our invasion into Iraq in 2003. I was told no flashlights, red light only, disregard shadows in the distant future, but look out for the packs of wild dogs. They were not as friendly as maybe others I might meet on that walk. We spent 6 months there building an air base that at first started arming and refueling A-10s out of Kuwait as the ground forces marched to Baghdad. Later, maybe 3 to 4 weeks later, those A-10s were restationed at Talil Air Base in southern Iraq. That was an interesting time. We went into full chem mop gear 5 times for real-world alarms, not knowing if it was Saddam's chemical weapons or a faulty detector. But those planes often returned with bullet holes in the fuselage, and we got the call on incredible communications gear that was changing the nature of warfare as the warfighter. That plane was coming back without an engine. It had taken a missile to that engine, but amazingly it landed and the pilot intact. But what we were seeing in an air operations center in that 2003 timeline was still light years beyond what CNN had showed us in 91 at the start of the Gulf War or in 01 with the Twin Towers. I'd go back to Iraq a year later, or for a year, much later, 2006, 2007, at a place called Balad. We were but 10 minutes from launch to impact of a neighboring country to the east's ballistic missiles. And at the time, one of the largest medical facilities in the field was established there. And that hospital was full every day of members who had lost limbs or were critically injured due to explosively formed projectiles that were being milled in that country to the east and smuggled in to attack Americans. That Balad Air Base was nicknamed Mortaritaville. We took rockets and mortar attack every day for that year, small arms fire on occasion. And our compound was about 100 yards from a tarmac that would host the C-5 or the C-17s when they came in. And that was the target of the rockets and mortars every day, unguided, routine. Memorial Day in 2007, I mentioned this on the floor, was on top of the wing commander's headquarters. Nothing but cigars, no bourbon, no beer, no wine, no big cookout, no family. But solemn cigars at night, watching the fire rings of F-16s take off on full afterburner and recollecting the names lost over the past year. I could go on a bit longer, but my career went for almost another decade, and the transformation in how American public and the world at large see war changed during that communications transition. The relationship that America has with its veterans has significantly changed as well. And while I can't say it was communications technology that did it, that it was 9/11 that did it, but it's somewhere along the line that Rubicon changed from, no war is ever going to have 100% American support, so there's always going to be opposing views. But those opposing views took root in online forums. It took root in counter stories on the news, but it took root in a different way that veterans experience today, and hopefully many of you experience on Memorial Day today. It was that the relationship with the veteran changed. we went back to honoring and revering the service and the sacrifice that veterans gave to honor and protect the United States, regardless of our view of the conflict. We were able to distinguish and separate those. And so as we go into Memorial Day, if you haven't had a chance to already, please take time to honor those who ultimately paid the sacrifice with their lives in support of something they believed in, which was the protection and the defense of the United States. I'll tell you, airmen, soldiers, Marines in combat zones don't necessarily always agree with the reasons that we're there, but they agree that they are a team and they have each other's back on that battlefield, regardless of what our nation's leaders have asked them to go do. And so when they return, remember, they didn't choose where or the nature of the conflict. What they chose was that oath to the United States. And what I ask you to choose, regardless of your views on the conflict at hand, today, a year ago, 10 years ago, 10 years from now, please understand the significant difference between displeasure with any ongoing military operations and reverence and honor for those who served. No one who's been through war wants war. We actively avoid it. We are a nation that takes our bumps and our bruises and attacks routinely with no counter response. But on occasion, a response is necessary, and our veterans are asked to go do that work. So please, today, tonight, reverence and honor for those who have lost their lives, support for the family members who remain, and always have a blessed Memorial Day. Honor our veterans and certainly have reverence for those who've lost their lives in the line of duty. Thank you.